Hi, and welcome to the When Women Fly podcast. Each episode, I have poignant conversations with women who fly, run, surf, ski, climb, or otherwise soar, and possess a passion for life that is infectious. These are honest and insightful conversations about dreams and reinvention, often in the face of uncertainty, doubt, or other impediments. We talk about busting paradigms, grit, working hard, and playing hard, all while building a community around the empowering metaphor of flight. I am your host, Sylvia Winter, a pilot, runner, mother, skier, list maker, and apparently podcaster. I believe that when we share our stories, own our fears, and dismantle our perceived limitations, the possibilities are boundless. Whether you're pursuing your passion or simply love the idea of possibility and wonder, this podcast is for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let's get started. The outdoors plays an important role in this podcast. We play, work, learn, and dream here, but it is more than a theater platform where we stage much of our lives. We rely on the air, water, and land. When I heard my guest today, Lindsay Bourgoine, speak a few months ago to an audience of policymakers, with her petite and bright presence pointing keenly to the issues of climate change and a viable future for the outdoor state, I knew she had something worth sharing here. As an avid outdoor enthusiast, her trajectory started as a kid, growing up climbing, hiking, and skiing with her dad in the state of Maine. She worked on conservation and recreation policy issues after college, completed a master's in environmental law from Vermont Law School, and coached skiing at Squaw Valley, before landing her current job as Director of Policy and Advocacy for Protect Our Winters. Protect Our Winters, or POW, is a community of athletes, scientists, creatives, and business leaders advancing non-partisan policies that protect our world today and for future generations. What does it take to protect our winters? Lawmakers make decisions every day about how to treat the places we cherish, whether that is the air, the water, the land. Those decisions affect access, environmental health, and the future of what the outdoors looks like. Many of us, and the women in this podcast included, become activists by being touched and motivated by pressing issues. We use our access to followers, perhaps a dash of acumen and passion, to create platforms where messages are amplified and heard by a wider audience. Lindsay makes the connection between a love of the outdoors and the importance of protecting it with work on policy. It has always been important in my interviews here to talk with women about how they have given back and their strong feelings about a cause for change that they are working towards. In this episode, instead of the activism being a side dish, we are taking a deep dive into the life of an activist with a capital A. Lindsay shares with us how Protect Our Winters pushes for policy changes while examining the root causes of climate degradation. The key to creating a career in activism is to find ways to bring your beliefs and values into your work. For Lindsay, this is the feature, the plat du jour, not a side dish. Combining activism with your career choice requires creativity and resourcefulness. If you are listening to this podcast, you likely live much of your life in connection with the outdoors. This conversation reminds us how precious this connection is and how important it is to address climate change for the future of our collective outdoor state. If you are only just discovering the When Women Fly podcast, or if you have been along for the ride, I post new episodes every week, so let me know what you think and what you want to hear more or less of. Follow, share, and review. You are part of this project, and I would love to hear from you. Now, enjoy this conversation with Lindsay Bourgoine. She is sharp and wise, and if this woman ever flew into politics, heads up. Hey, Lindsay, I am thrilled to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely excited to be here and really humbled to be a guest on your podcast.
So I like to set the stage and frame our deep dive into your journey by hearing of your family influences and culture. What was your childhood like?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a small town in Maine, and I genuinely wouldn't have it any other way. It was such an incredible landscape to grow up in. And I think just the diversity of forests and mountains and lakes and an ocean, there were just so many opportunities to get outside. And I definitely grew up in an outdoor family. My parents actually met in an adult ed backpacking class where my dad was the teacher and my mom was the student. So pretty cliche. But we camped and we hiked and we cross country skied. And I just have so many memories of being outside. And if I wasn't outside, my desire to be in it. And I was kind of reflecting on that this morning. And I have this one memory of an early winter where I got too cold and I had to come inside. And I remember sitting in the kitchen sink and watching my sister continue to ice skate through the window on the pond behind our house. And I was so jealous that I couldn't stay outside longer. And she was playing Christy Yamaguchi, which, if you can remember back to those days of the
Yeah.
ice skating and the Olympics, it was just a really kind of magical childhood.
So winter played a big role in your love of the outdoors as well.
Yeah, I think if you if you are from Maine, you either love it or hate it. I
Yeah.
feel really fortunate to have loved it.
And you spent a lot of time with your father doing outdoor activities, didn't you?
Yeah, my dad really passed on the love of the outdoors that he had to me and started taking me on different climbing and backpacking trips when I was in high school, and just really had an incredible journey learning from him and his friends. I kind of called those experiences my old man trips, to his chagrin, which he didn't really like. But he has such a great network of climbing buddies and friends, and I feel like they're all uncles to me and mentors in the outdoor space.
And so then you went on to Skidmore College and have a BA in environmental sciences and geosciences. And then you went on to a master's in environmental law. But tell me how you approached your school choices and what influenced your decisions to major in environmental studies and geo.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like most 18-year-olds, I went to college thinking, I know exactly what I want to do. And for me, that was international relations and Spanish. And I really had no idea. And I knew I loved the outdoors, but at my high school, if you were on the advanced placement track, you took 2 years of bio and chemistry and physics, and you really just skipped right over earth sciences. So I never really had that experience. So I decided to try that out. And I took this class called Field Studies in Environmental Science my second semester freshman year, and I actually looked up the description today, and it's described as an interdisciplinary natural science approach to the study of environmental issues. And it was taught by an ecologist, a geologist, a chemist, and a mycologist. And I really just found the intersection of all these disciplines really fascinating, and combined that with the opportunity to do field work. It was just an immediate fit.
And were you thinking about how you can combine your love of being outdoors and work at that time? Or did it just come naturally that that's what your interests led you to?
Yeah, it really just came naturally. I think it was kind of like, okay, these classes seem to have field trips where we can spend time outside and learning about the natural environment. And this is a place I've spent a lot of time and made a lot of observations, but really don't have any academic background behind. So it was definitely exciting to learn.
Hmm. So it sounds like you were really internally driven in that case. Were there external factors that either encouraged you or discouraged you from following that path?
I think it really was all internal. I've always had this really strong internal drive, and sometimes it's so intense, like especially that comes up in sports where I'll, finish a race and I'll be completely miserable. And I actually have no idea where that drive comes from sometimes. Something I'd really love to spend some more time digging into in my life. But I think in college, I had this really strong internal feeling that if I wanted to do environmental work, I think that one should understand the science behind it. And to be honest, science is not my strong suit. It's not, it's not where I do well. You try taking organic chemistry and let me know how that goes.
Yeah.
It was hard for me, but I felt like if this is what I want to do and I want to advocate for the environment, I need to have a critical understanding of why this is important in the first place. And I'm really proud of myself for,
For putting yourself out there.
yeah.
And what were you doing in the outdoors during that time?
I was doing a lot of trips around Maine. I landed my first job after college back in Maine, working for a conservation and recreation group called the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I really feel like it afforded me the opportunity to travel around and explore different parts of Maine that I had never really been to. I think people forget sometimes, especially those of us that live out west now, how big Maine is compared to so many New England states. And yeah, it was really amazing to see different places and be exposed to different types of outdoor recreation and activities.
So tell us more about your jobs and some of the first ones you took after your BA.
Yeah, absolutely. So I landed that job with the Appalachian Mountain Club, and I spent about half my time in the Maine State House up in Augusta advocating for conservation legislation. And to me, that was just such an exciting opportunity. I felt really privileged to play that role because I was very exposed as a young person to people with just such a variety of different perspectives and backgrounds and educational experiences. And one of the things I loved about the Maine legislature, which is kind of wonky, but they have something called a lay legislature, which means that everybody that serves in office also has another job and a career. They're not professional politicians like there are in some states. I don't have anything against that, but I liked that it felt like this was a community of real people that were taking a few months out of their year to dedicate to public service, and to learn all about those different types of people and their experiences was really incredible.
Yeah, that's a really interesting model. What do you think the origin of that is? Just the practicality of having people serve with a lower population?
This is totally speculation, but thinking back to like agrarian economies,
Right.
probably people only had a few months a year to come together when they weren't, working the land to make decisions about how they wanted to be governed. And so kind of that model has continued in places like Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, many of the New England states.
So you worked for AMC, and did you work in the huts?
I did, yeah. So I spent every summer in college working in a backcountry hut system along the Appalachian Trail. And that was such a formative experience for me. It's essentially a backcountry hut, a backcountry hostel where you're serving guests, adults who come and stay overnight and cooking food for them. I have on my resume that I can cook dinner for 60. That's pretty common if you work there. I also can compost food in alpine environments and work with composting toilets. There's lots of things that aren't exciting about that job, but it really taught me self-sufficiency. One season I was up there and it got really cold and the pipes burst, and you don't call the plumber. No, nobody's coming to help you on the side of a mountain. And so figuring things out for yourself with the tools and resources that you have. And then I think the second piece there was really community. The network of people that I met in that system are my best friends to date, including my husband. And I just feel really privileged to know those people. They've all just become such leaders in the environmental and the outdoor world. And network has really carried me far.
That's really interesting. So that job that you all shared at the young age has been a stepping stone for further work in that area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. And do you have a favorite hut?
A favorite hut? That's a great question. I worked for 2 seasons, my first season and my last season, which was really nice in terms of bookends, at a hut called Greenleaf, which is on the side of Franconia Ridge, Mount Lafayette, and kind of the west side of the White Mountains. And I just love that area and that region. And this summer I was actually fortunate to come back to Maine and to New Hampshire and did what's called a Pemi Loop, which is a 30-mile day hike around the Pemigewasset Wilderness. And you actually finish up on Franconia Ridge. And we were there around 5 o'clock, kind of in that September sunset, and looking down on Greenleaf Hut. I was hiking with my husband and 2 friends who I worked in the huts with. And, I had this realization on this hike of like, we're no longer these hut kids. We're like adults. We're having real conversations. We're not like running in between, trying to get things done. We're just out for a day. And when we kind of looked down on Greenleaf, I think it hit all of us of what a privilege it was to call that place home.
Yeah. And what does it feel like to live in the West, live in Boulder, and you having lived there for a while now, coming back to the East and seeing some of the magic there?
Yeah, I think they're just totally different landscapes in my mind. I think of places in my mind with almost color schemes. It's kind of a weird thing, but Colorado is so like blue and gold to me, and Maine is so kind of like there's like purple hues and brown hues and kind of like that winter when you think about it. And just yeah, really different landscapes, and I have so much appreciation for both of them. But I think one thing that I really value about being from the East is because there aren't these like insane big mountains or so many opportunities, that kind of the landscape forces us to be closer together as a community, because everyone goes to Tuckerman Ravine to ski. That is kind of like the mecca, right? There aren't thousands of places to do that type of skiing. And so it really just breeds a really strong community. And I've loved my time out West, but I have not seen that same type of community that's so, we all have a chip on our shoulder. We're so hardcore. We'll go out in the ice and in the dampness. And I really love that about East Coasters, kind of that grit that we all have and carry.
You do have to get out there and all ice and rain and wind and still find the love. Yeah, that's really neat. So you, after we sort of diverted a little bit, but you worked in Maine and you worked for AMC, and then you did decide to go to get a master's in environmental law. Tell me what was behind that decision.
Yeah, I think I loved what I was doing in Maine, but I think sometimes when we don't fundamentally understand what we are doing, whether that's academically or in some way, we tune out. And that's definitely been a theme in my life. And I think all of us can sit back to a time we've been in a classroom and the teacher's talking about something we don't get, and we just shut our mind off and think about something else. And I remember being in this conference room, and I was working on a wind power siting bill, which is actually something that to this day I'm still very passionate about, of clean energy. And we were trying to see if there was a way that wind power developers could be part of something called an adjudicatory hearing. And I remember being like, I have no idea what that means. I can't even pronounce this word. I'm just, I don't know how helpful I'm being in this conversation. And I think this ties back to role models in my life. I feel like my parents have been really incredible role models to me in terms of being lifelong learners and always learning and pushing and themselves to try new things. And I think for me, I knew that it was time to do some learning and truly dive in to the academic principles behind what I was advocating for, to build on that scientific background, but have some sort of policy and legal expertise.
Hmm. And you chose to go to Vermont Law. And what was behind that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. Vermont Law School has this really, I'm going to sound like an ad for a minute, but I really genuinely enjoyed my time there. They have this really innovative program called a Master's of Environmental Law and Policy. And it's a 12-month program where they kind of throw you in cold turkey into the law school environment, which is super intimidating. But you basically are able to learn at a law school for a year about law and policy without going through a full legal program and becoming a JD, a Juris Doctor. So I'm not an attorney, but I'm able to really speak that language and understand that perspective. I will say it's challenging going to a law school and saying like, I don't want to be a lawyer, but I'm here to learn. Kind of just a funny perspective to be in, but I really valued that learning and that opportunity.
Hmm. So when you finished Vermont Law, it wasn't quite an easy slide into the next stage, or at least maybe you were benched for a bit and you made some decisions to go out west. So what was behind those decisions?
Yeah, I think I love the way you just put that. I think I might use that myself. But I think in general, like maybe taking a step back to before Vermont Law School, I don't know if this is real life or if it's just me, but it has always felt like major transitions in my life have just been kind of crazy storms where I'm not in the right place. I'm not in the mindset to move forward, but kind of forced to make a decision and have to drop everything that I'm doing. And that can be the place I live, the job I have, my community, like even the people I was dating, and just move on. And I think there's a sense of sadness in that, but I've honestly had no regrets. And I've called so many people and places home that I've just built this network across the country where there's always a piece of something comforting and familiar nearby. And so, kind of a quick anecdote there would be I left the Appalachian Mountain Club to go to Vermont Law School. I was really excited about that. And then I saw this job at a group called the Outdoor Industry Association in Colorado. And I thought, that looks really interesting. And I called Vermont Law School and they said, we'll always be here. We're an educational institution, so we're not going anywhere. So I decided to apply and I went out to Lake Tahoe to visit some friends. And I got a call that I got the job there, and I had to fly back and get my stuff from Vermont and put it in a U-Haul and move to Colorado. And then I did eventually decide to leave Colorado and go to Vermont. And I moved back there and I blew the engine in my Subaru on the side of the road in New York on Christmas Eve. And it's just kind of like, why does, this happen? But it was really similar when I left Vermont Law School too. It was kind of like, okay, what's next? You don't often line up that perfect job and that perfect opportunity right away. And you kind of just got to keep your head down. And I think my mantra through this has just always been to keep making decisions. And some of them are going to be wrong decisions, and that's okay. But it's that, you're just making a path and moving forward and reacting to what you learn. And I think that ties back to me. Most of my friends know me as a mega over planner, and they probably hate my emails that have every single detail that you could ever need for every adventure we go on. But I love planning, but I also am totally comfortable when things just go haywire and you have to adapt and again make those decisions to figure out what's next.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's as if you're comfortable doing the hard pivot, almost to be a counterpoint to the planning self, which can be kind of overwhelming for your own self, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of like what's kind of impacted my mindset, I think there's this like, not to get super cliche, but there's this quote from C.S. Lewis that I really love that just kind of like, there are far, far better things ahead than anything we leave behind. And it's in a little frame behind me right now. But it's just kind
Wait,
of a
say that.
reminder.
Say it again.
Yeah, there are far, far better things ahead than anything we leave behind.
I love it.
And just kind of a reminder to keep seeking and to keep pushing yourself and to keep learning. And again, I think that ties back to my role models and my parents of kind of what I was talking about of their love of lifelong learning. And I feel like if you kind of stop and stall and stop making decisions, you're not really learning or applying what you've learned.
Hmm. So how did you navigate the transition after Vermont Law School?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard. I think it's really important to acknowledge when things are hard and know that we can also do hard things. Clearly, I finished and I didn't have a job, and I was pretty nervous about that. I wasn't somebody that had a big bank account to rely on at that point and needed to figure out how to make my own way and support myself. And I think this was a good reminder. I remember a friend in Vermont who maybe has no idea how influential what he said to me was, but it was, Lindsay, you love skiing and you just finished school. It's December. It's right at the beginning of a ski season. Why don't you go be a ski bum? And I just remember thinking like, that's so simple and that's so honest. And why not take this time where it feels like I'm lacking in a career and try something that's really about my personal passions? And so I got a job coaching the development racing team in Lake Tahoe at Squaw Valley. And that was just such a really positive experience for me and so rejuvenating, to be honest. After, my last semester at Vermont Law School, I was taking 6 classes. And I think for the first time understood what my capacity was and what my limits were. And to honestly just be able to ski every day and ski with a bunch of 9-year-olds who didn't want to talk about environmental law. It was truly exactly what I needed. And from there, really thinking about what skills do I want to learn so that when the right job comes around, I can prepare myself. And for me, I ended up taking an internship at a government agency. And that was a perspective. Like I had worked in advocacy, had worked in business and nonprofit, but I hadn't really had that kind of agency government experience. And so it was kind of like, okay, let's try that out for a little bit. And that was really helpful. So kind of constantly thinking about building.
And how did you end up at Protect Our Winters?
It's a good story. I had heard about Protect Our Winters, when I was out in Colorado at the Outdoor Industry Association, going to the trade shows, and had heard about this nonprofit, and I really loved it. And I actually, I bought a laptop when I went to Vermont Law School because I didn't have a personal computer, and it had one sticker on it through Vermont Law School, and it was a POW sticker. And I had no idea that I would go on to end up working there, but it's just kind of a funny little premonition there. But I did a lot of networking when I was at Vermont Law School and put myself out there a lot. And I think it can feel really scary sometimes to just kind of constantly be applying to jobs and never hearing back and sending people emails and never hearing back. But I did send one to POW and talked a lot about my skill set and why I thought I would be a good fit. And that email ended up in somebody's inbox and they read it and they thought, this is interesting, but we're not hiring right now. And I'm going to file this away until I am. And when the organization was hiring, they actually reached out and called me. And I think that's a great, of course, there's a considerable amount of luck in that, but I think it's a great anecdote of like, don't doubt some of the work that you put into.
It also sounds like it reflected as much about Protect Our Winters and where they were. This was what year?
2016.
Okay. So, and it's changed, when you came on board, it changed a lot, but it could be as much about them not being ready for your application than anything inherent in your application. But they did call you back or at some point or reach out to you.
Yeah, it was like 10 months later, 8 months later, something like that.
Yeah.
Never doubt. And really talked about a position that they had. And I think what I loved about POW and why I was so excited to take a job there is I've always been really driven by influence. It was something that I saw in the Maine legislature of if you have some sort of influence, whether that's, a business and economic power, that there is a lot of power in advocacy and policy in that regard. And at POW, working with influencers and trying to lean on that to push a cultural shift is a key part of our theory of change. And I think that's kind of been my niche and my goal. And then second, I would just say, I think there's so many environmental issues we could all work on, and there's so much opportunity to do good work in the environmental sector and arena, but climate really is the apex issue. It really is something that impacts every single one of those environmental buckets, if you will. And so to me, I felt really ready to take that head on as well. And even though, again, that was a sphere like, I came from a recreation and conservation background. So it was a new arena that I would have to learn about, but I was really ready for that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And what is Protect Our Winters?
Yeah, so POW is a national nonprofit, and our mission is really about helping passionate outdoor people protect the places and the lifestyles they love from climate change. So really thinking about this community of outdoor people, which we actually call the outdoor state. So there are 50 million Americans that love to hike and bike and ski and climb and fish. And really just thinking about like, what could the power be if that community took action together and prioritized climate together? And the theory of change behind the organization is really like the policies and solutions that we need to solve climate largely exist. There's not a ton of work that we need to do. Certainly there's more innovation to be had, but the solutions largely exist, but we don't have the political will to pass those policies and solutions. And so how do we create the political will? And to us, that comes through cultural change and working with people that have a lot of influence on culture. And so that's why POW has really sat at the forefront of working with professional athletes who we know, cultivate this incredible following, and thinking about how do we work with professional athletes to have them share climate advocacy opportunities and make climate action a critical part of being somebody who considers themselves an outdoor person.
Mm-hmm. So if I was to take a page out of the playbook, what would be an example of using a well-known athlete to stand for a cause?
Yeah, I think first it has to come authentically. I think, you can look at so many organizations or even just businesses or sponsors of professional athletes. And I think when we look at social media, we can all see when something's, a clear ad or a clear like, okay, this isn't really, in this person's wheelhouse or mindset. But I think for us at POW, we do get a lot of questions like, how do you get so many athletes? These athletes are seeing the changes firsthand in the mountains. We don't have to convince any of them that climate change is real, that it's a major issue, or that it's going to have a major impact on their personal lifestyle and livelihood. And so most of them come directly to Protect Our Winters and ask, like, how can I help? And I think that's the driver, is that authenticity of then when one of our athletes is talking about, hey, in 2020, there's this election coming up and we have the opportunity to turn out and vote with climate as a priority. It's authentic and it's coming from the heart and coming via their true passions.
And what's your role in facilitating their advocacy?
Yeah, so for the past 4 years, I've worked on kind of policy and advocacy there and leading that kind of workload for the organization, which has been really fun. And so it really has been about thinking about when it comes to climate policy, just like environmental policy, there's so many things that we could do. There's so many solutions. And so how do we prioritize that? And what are the policy solutions that are the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to actually reducing carbon emissions? So thinking through that policy agenda, and then under that policy agenda, where are there opportunities to make change? And how do we actually influence those decisions? So are those decisions happening at the state level? Are they happening in Washington, D.C.? Now, many of those decisions are happening with our presidential administration. So kind of where are those conversations and those advocacy opportunities happening? And then how do we intersect and kind of infiltrate them? And so is that bringing an athlete to Washington, D.C. to speak with a lawmaker? Is it having an athlete speak at a press conference in Carson City, Nevada, as Nevada is making a decision about clean energy? Kind of where do we need to show up, and how do we cultivate both our grass tops, which is our kind of our influencers and our leaders, but also our grassroots, that outdoor state, to rally behind these issues?
And are you more behind the scenes setting up the interactions, or do you go to DC as well, don't you?
Yeah, but I will say, like, I think, when people ask me, like, what's the best part of your job? there's this picture that we work a lot with the creative Forrest Woodward, who's an incredible filmmaker and photographer. And he took this picture once, and I'm kind of in the corner, and there's an athlete talking to a lawmaker. And the athlete is asking the lawmaker to co-sponsor a bill to protect the Arctic refuge from drilling. And that lawmaker signed on to that bill that day. So it was this very tangible experience where it was like, okay, this is what this strategy looks like, and this is how we win. And I'm kind of like faded out in the background, and I'm so proud of like setting up those opportunities, but understanding my role in it isn't being the face of that.
And that feels very natural to you.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's really what motivates me in my job is, especially working with athletes, I think, not just for athletes, for employees of outdoor businesses, for our volunteers, for all of these people. I don't think people understand what power they can have as advocates or in front of lawmakers. I think it's really easy to, especially now, look at the political divide, see people as politicians and partisan. And yes, there is absolutely reality to that, but they're people. And connecting with people is something that we are good at as humans, and connecting over common ground and common stories and common pastimes. Like, we all know that the great outdoors isn't Republican or Democrat. It's a place for everyone. And so watching people connect with their lawmakers and truly not understanding how much of an impact they have, and then discovering that impact through that process, that's really what motivates me.
And it seems like the importance of community really comes out in your work. And you spoke earlier about the outdoor state. Speak more to this concept that POW has come up with, and correct me if I'm wrong, which I entirely could be, but I had saw it first moving up to the 2020 election and the campaign and the resources that POW spent trying to get the vote out. And so that was the first time I heard about this phrase, the outdoor state. But speak more to that, what the outdoor state is and how community plays a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the outdoor state, we really basically started looking at demographics of people in the outdoor sports community and thinking about how many people are part of this community that we say our audience at POW are passionate outdoor enthusiasts that love to do things like climb and bike and ski. But what's the reality of what does that look like in America? And so kind of ultimately came up with it's about 50 million Americans. And I think the reason that concept really came out in 2020 around the election was just thinking about, like, we always hear about swing states, right? It's like, what is Michigan going to do? What is North Carolina? This year we know Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania. What's going to happen in these states around elections? And what is that tiny margin that's going to make a difference? And what if we stopped thinking about geopolitical boundaries and we started thinking about community and kind of the size of our community? And what if we functioned, what if the outdoor state functioned as a swing state in an election? And when we look back on November 3rd, 2020, or even November 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, however long it took to get a final decision and a final count, that margin was very tight. And so I think thinking about the size of the outdoor state really lends us to thinking about our collective power and what we can really do together.
It's a really creative notion, which I'm really excited about, thinking about how we can think about making change and the role of community and the collective that is not based on these geopolitical borders that have sort of been ingrained in us as the way we organize our country's map.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's even more critical in the face of climate, because climate doesn't know borders. And it's also very difficult to address climate. Like, even when we think about, I think the Northeast, even going back, decades, and thinking about acid rain, all this acid rain pollution was coming from Midwestern power plants and kind of air pollution coming and then getting caught up in the way that air travels. And it's not a boundary issue. It's not Vermont's issue. It's not Maine's issue. And it's not really Ohio's issue either. It's just the air. So how do we think about things conceptually and address them where they are instead of trying to create boundaries around them?
Mm-hmm. And how has POW changed in the last 12 months?
Yeah. So obviously 2020, let's take a deep breath. 2020 was hard. 2020 was very hard. But again, as so many have said, we can do hard things. And I think for advocacy, especially when it comes to climate, what 2020 really taught us is that we can come together for collective impact. And I think about this a lot in the climate world of something maybe we didn't see before, where climate change is such an existential issue that I think until very recently has been really hard to see show up in our backyards, where we don't, it's like it's far off, it's and in these glaciers, it's all over the world, but it's not necessarily at home for me. And so to feel that physical, tangible impact that drives us to and motivates us to take action isn't always there. And I think tied to that is this feeling of like, this issue is so big, like, what do we actually do about it? And can we actually do anything about it? Like, is there hope? And I think with COVID, when we look back and we look at what happened last March and the stay-at-home orders, and the fact that those did work as a community, as a global community, when we took collective action, we were actually able to make collective impact. And I think how we heard that loud and clear from our community and our donors of like, I see this now and I see this connection to climate and I understand that we can do something about this. So I think in a sense, it was really motivating and in a tiny way inspirational.
Because it was made clear that collective action can result in change that is on a large scale.
Yeah. And I think that really played out in so many different conversations in 2020.
Mm-hmm. And how did 2020 impact you as an advocate on the ground?
I think it just came down to like really thinking back through creativity and kind of that point that I was saying earlier of constantly making decisions. There were things that we had to do, and we could have sat there and wallowed and thought like, how is this going to work now? We're all virtual. We're all at home. We're not connected. We can't build our community anymore. But really trying to think through that pivot and take it head on. And I'm really proud of our organization and what we did. And I think for me personally, a good example is in June, shortly after kind of all the shutdowns in March, we decided to do a virtual lobby day. And to be honest, now that's a really common tactic. A lot of groups are doing virtual meetings with lawmakers in Washington, D.C. But at the time, it was like, what is that? And I still remember I got a call from a policy director at another outdoor environmental organization saying, hey, we heard you did this and we want to know about it. And how did you do it? And what was it? And I remember in my head thinking like, I don't know, I just made this up. Like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm just figuring it out as I go. And I think trusting ourselves and trusting that we have the skill sets to pivot in really hard times is important.
And on a personal level, how did you balance your planning self and your happy to pivot self?
Yeah. I mean, I think that they kind of go hand in hand in a weird way. It's like it is planning by pivoting, right? It is kind of trying the next thing. And so I think that was really helpful. And to kind of take that to a very personal level, I also had planned an 150-person wedding last September in 2020. And that obviously, was not going to be a reality. And so I think in a really similar way, it was kind of like, how do we come up with new creative ideas and ways to do something that's important that really strips away kind of the, I think when you think about it in the context of a wedding, like, let's forget about the caterers, let's forget about the decorations, and let's talk about like, what is a wedding and what is the value of that and what is most important. And to us, that came down to family. And so figuring out how do we do this in a way that works for our families. And I think it's the same professionally. Why are we trying to meet with lawmakers? What is important? And then from there, kind of like, okay, what are the mechanisms to do that if showing up on the ground doesn't work anymore?
Yeah, I agree. It did feel like, especially through 2020, and I don't think it's ended, that there's been this clarity, if we're willing to sort of stop and look at it, in values.
Absolutely.
Priorities. Not necessarily our choice, but there are lessons in there.
For sure.
So let me take us maybe back to you at work and you paving a way as a young woman when you were in Maine, but you're still a woman, obviously. So tell me about sort of where you show up in the minority and how you feel it is important to represent women in spaces that you don't see other women in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to your point, kind of working in the Maine State House, most people won't be surprised when I say I was one of the only 23-year-old lobbyists. And especially when you think about the fact that Maine is actually the oldest state in the nation, it's not hard to see what that looks like. And I think I learned really quickly that people will judge you by how you look and what they expect you to say. But I felt that if I put in the work, it was more challenging for those people to put those labels on me. I guess what I mean by that is like, so part of my role there was giving public testimony a lot as an environmental advocate. So I would go to hearings, and eventually, different people knew me, but I wasn't there full time. So I think I was still, not a very familiar face. And in the Maine legislature, you step up to like a podium before you speak before a committee. If you don't know me, you wouldn't know that I'm not 5 feet tall, but I am not. It was a milestone I never hit, unfortunately, even though I tried to get the DMV to say that I was on my license. They denied me that.
Nearly.
Yes, nearly,
Yeah.
not quite. And so with the podium, there's actually this giant crank on the side, and you crank it up or down to accommodate for your height. And so I always had the pleasure of walking up to the podium and turning the crank, and it would squeak horribly and like move down. And I could see all of the lawmakers sitting there thinking, I look very young, and I'm sure that they were like, who is this high schooler? And like, what is she doing in the state house? And really casting a lot of doubt on me. And I loved the challenge of coming up with incredibly articulate testimony, smart testimony, and delivering it and feeling like at the end of that, nobody is making those judgments anymore. I absolutely understand that doesn't work in every scenario. There are massive inequalities that don't allow for us to change the judgments that people make on us just by speaking our mind. Absolutely. But I think for me, it was helpful to know that I could change people's minds. And I continue to think about that in my job today, and being younger, looking younger, being a woman in these spaces where there are many places, especially in the outdoor industry, certainly something the industry is working to address, where it is largely older male dominated, and trying to diversify perspectives that show up and make space for those voices.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel like it was an advantage to you at times?
What I felt like I could do, which I understand some people may disagree with, this was kind of like where I landed, and what I felt at the time was thinking through, how do I use this as an advantage? And how do I think about the different perspective that I bring and use it? I know that sounds weird, but in Maine, the legislature, as I mentioned, is a lay legislature. There's a lot of older folks, and I think some of them legitimately was thinking of like, oh, this is like a granddaughter to me, or this is like, I had my friends' parents were in, different positions of power. And I thought, you know what, like I can connect with people because I'm friends with their children or I'm friends with their grandchildren. And instead of being this environmental lobbyist and being seen as like, well, she's green, she's left, she's this way, of like, why don't I just be me and connect with people through people and kind of lean on that? And I really think that's important to think about, is what is the value in the diversity and the perspective that you bring to the table, and what are ways you can use that to your advantage?
It sounds like you had a lot of confidence in yourself and the relationship aspect of moving your cause forward.
I think it's easy to say that now.
Yeah,
In reflection.
sure.
It was very intimidating in the moment. And, when I worked for that organization, I had an incredible mentor, incredible boss who I really looked up to and I really valued. But we worked from a satellite office. And so there were 2 of us. And so the goal was to double the capacity in Maine and to split responsibilities. So I was usually at the state house by myself, and not necessarily with somebody that was mentoring me on the ground. I definitely sought out and found those mentors in the environmental community. But yeah, I still remember like standing outside the state house door and saying like, okay, take a deep breath. Here we go. Like, we have no idea what this is going to be today or what it's going to feel like. But this is the job and the path that you're choosing.
Pull it together.
Yeah.
Where do you see yourself having the biggest impact in that setting?
I think in general, kind of like this like line that I'm following right now that I'm really passionate about is thinking about influence and the impact that organizations and companies and athletes can have in doing good. And I know this is taking that question a bit on a tangent, but I tell this anecdote a lot, and I apologize because I'm going to tell it again. But when I was in the Maine legislature, I was advocating for a bill for state park funding, which seems like a pretty no-brainer of like, why wouldn't we want to pay for state parks? But lo and behold, sometimes these things become controversial. And I couldn't figure out how to make the space for a compelling argument on this and to be able to convince people that had different perspectives that were really concerned about economics in the budget. And I was eventually able, through half of my job was working on conservation, the other half was working on recreation. Through that community, I worked closely with LL Bean, and I asked somebody from LL Bean, which again, if you're in Maine, you know that's one of the largest employers and a huge brand identity for our state, to make a phone call behind the scenes about this. And essentially the issue became moot pretty quickly because it was, the buzz was like, oh, one of the largest employers called us and this is what they think of that. And this is critical to their bottom line. And really understanding that opportunity and thinking about the impact. And there's certainly a piece of me that's like, wow, Lindsay, like you take companies to like swing their economic bats on environmental policy, and you show up in Washington, D.C. with Olympians with gold medals that essentially serve as keys to get them into very partisan doors. But at the end of the day, if the ultimate goal there is for environmental protection and for a future of a healthy climate, like I think we all have this tie of like a lobbyist is such a bad word and they must be getting something for it. But I think it's not. It's, well, it just depends on what you're getting at the end of the day. And to me, a healthier climate is absolutely not, I mean, it's certainly a benefit to me, but it's not the same as the way we affiliate that word. So I think the impact, to totally circle back, is the power in unusual allies and unusual voices and bringing those to the table, seeking them out and finding space for them.
I have been thinking about how POW uses influencers and the impact, and like your example with LL Bean as well. And, to be honest, I love the results, but there's this little bit of part of me that's like, darn, why do we need
Yeah.
either capitalism or popularity to push these issues forward? So what do you say to the general public about impact?
Yeah, I think I feel that too. And I think, kind of going back to what I was just saying, I reflect on that a lot of like, okay, like, why are we in this situation? How do we end up here? But I think whether this comes from my Irish Catholic grandmother, but I am a realist and a pragmatist at heart. And I think it's understanding the reality of the situation we're in. And I think for me, a good tie to this is I grew up in a pretty political family where politics were talked about around the dinner table all the time. And quite frankly, I hated it. I didn't like the he said, she said, the, partisan nature of it, the disagreement, the public bashing. And, I didn't want any part of that, which is kind of funny that I've landed in this world of politics and policy now. But what I've realized is it's about people, and it's about connecting with people, and it's about changing. And also, I could decide I don't like this political system that we have. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But that's the reality of where we're at. So in my mind, it's like jump in and attack the system from the inside, if you will, and make change rather than walking away and saying like, this doesn't work for me. Like in my mind, that's not helpful.
Yeah, I really like your positive attitude and resourcefulness. I think it's very impactful. How do you stay grounded amongst all these things that you are passionate about?
Yeah, I think to me, it's recognizing that there is an entire community that is doing this type of work, whether that's advocacy, whether that's climate, whether that's environmental work and equity work, justice work. And I am one of so many, and I'm not doing this work alone. And I think coming to work every day with really incredible coworkers that I learn from daily, it's really reminding yourself of the collective effort and the collective impact, and that it will carry us.
Mm-hmm. What is influencing you right now, Lindsay, as far as books you're reading or authors?
Yeah, absolutely. I love to read. And a few years ago, one of my coworkers set a New Year's resolution that was to read first thing when he woke up every day and last thing before he went to bed every night. And I took that to heart. And that is something I have done for the last few years. I just finished a book called A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. And I've been very interested in learning more about Indigenous identity and culture and the history behind colonization. And that ties to right now, I'm reading a book called This Radical Land by Dagan Miller. And it really questions the concept of wilderness and evaluates what is the true human history. And I think this is just such a critical conversation for the outdoor industry, the outdoor community, the outdoor state, as we've talked about. And I understand that this has been, a discussion for decades and years, and I'm excited to see kind of the collective narratives really coming to the forefront on this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the context in which our moment takes place and stitch it together.
Absolutely.
Is there one issue that you can call out that you are extremely passionate about right now?
I think I would just say the opportunity that we are being presented by having an amenable federal government on climate policy. And I think it's very it's easy to say okay, we elected people that prioritize this issue, let's get it done. And I think the reality is we all know it's not that simple. And so what I'm passionate about is fighting apathy. I think it's really easy for us as advocates to say okay, we made it, and to take a deep breath. We all have been working so hard, and so many of us put in so much time in 2020, in a year that was just so challenging on so many levels. And I think it's easy to take a step back. And the reality is that we need to do the opposite. And so kind of figuring out, how do we continue to motivate our community and ourselves in this moment at a chance where we have pretty incredible opportunity to rebuild our economy in a way that is going to work for climate.
I really like what you just said, fighting apathy. I'm going to sit with that for a bit. That's really
something I wish we didn't have to do.
Yeah, but it's important.
Reality.
Yeah. So we're in the home stretch, Lindsay, but I want to ask you, in this podcast, we celebrate the spirit of taking on challenges and reaching beyond predetermined heights. We use the metaphor of flight, and for some it's a symbol, and for some it is both a symbol and a pursuit. But can you leave us with a closing thought about your passion to quote unquote fly and pursuing that passion?
Absolutely. I think for me, this plays out in kind of continuously pushing myself to learn and to take on new pursuits and learning, which feel really intimidating and scary. And I know this isn't the greatest note to end on, but I've decided in this last year to, because of the flexibility of working from home, because of the circumstances of COVID, to take time to do a graduate certificate. So I'm doing a program in clean energy right now, and I'm in this class right now on project finance, and it's not great. No, I'm just kidding. But it's very challenging. And I think it's a reminder every day of when I show up that I'm showing up for myself and for my drive to continue to learn, even when it's a really challenging subject that isn't exactly what I'm passionate about, but it's giving me context, and it's going to help me to fly in the future and to take leaps and to, create opportunities for myself that I can jump into. And so it really does show up as an opportunity to learn and to push yourself to learn.
And how do you set those goals, those sort of short-term goals and long-term goals, or do you?
Yeah, I had a really awesome mentor about a decade ago that really encouraged me through a leadership program to write a personal and professional leadership plan. And I don't think until that point in my life, somebody had asked me to put my personal life into my professional life. And to be honest, that isn't something I've revisited recently, but it really struck a chord for me of thinking about what are the things that we want in our personal lives and how do those match with our professional lives, and how do we do those things at the same time and prioritize in between those? Because I think it's so easy to say, these are my top 3 priorities this month in my personal life, and these are those at work. And we don't actually know, if you took the top 3 from each, what do those 6 look like on paper, and what really is the priority, and are they the right priorities? And so really putting those things together and evaluating them collectively.
Yeah. And what you just said about prioritizing and understanding what happens in between, that could be a whole nother journal entry.
Yes, absolutely.
Lindsay, what's your favorite winter sport?
It is skiing. I know that's cliche saying I work for Protect Our Winters, but I feel really fortunate to have grown up cross country skiing. And then I have a dear uncle who took me downhill skiing for the first time when I was in third grade. And to me, that really does embody the spirit of flying. It's a pretty incredible feeling.
It really does, doesn't it? I think it's just a different version of the same sensation, honestly.
Absolutely.
Do you have any other message that you would like to share with the world or women who are listening to this podcast or people who are listening that are energized by social movements or being part of a mass movement?
I think it's just that constant reminder or that kind of mindset that I've attached myself to that I would encourage other people to think about, which is about continuing to make decisions. And even in the face of challenge and even in the face of feeling total loss or at a loss and not understanding what's next for yourself or for a movement, but deciding that you're going to make a decision to continue and not being afraid of the fact that it may be completely wrong. And we may have to backtrack and we may have to try something differently or adjust, but it's the fact that we're going to continue moving. And that decision certainly can be to take space for yourself and allow yourself time. But to me, that is still an active decision that we are making.
Yeah, I can sit with that one too. Where can we learn more about POW and your projects?
Yeah, you can find us at protectourwinters.org or on Instagram at protectourwinters. And we're gearing up for a couple campaigns this year that we're really excited to engage the outdoor state in. So please join us.
And if someone has never gone to the Protect Our Winters website, where would you direct them first?
There is a link on the top that says Take Action, and that really shows our active campaigns. And I think that's a great place to kind of dive in a little and learn a little more about some of the policies and the work that we do.
Awesome. I will make sure that we have those resources in our show notes. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for taking the time for this conversation. I've learned a lot and have a lot to mull over and think about. You have a lot of wisdom and insight.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoy learning along the way. So I appreciate all of your questions and helping me with self-reflection too.
Thank you for listening to the When Women Fly podcast. My hope is that you leave this conversation with a sense of curiosity and empowerment to hold on to what is important and let go to what weighs you down. Stare fear in the face. If you like this episode of the When Women Fly podcast, be sure to share and subscribe and let us know what you think. We love feedback. Be brave, be bold, and fly. See you next time.